A very warm welcome to EPG Pathshala, and I'm Dr. Swati Banerjee, Associate Professor at the School of Social Work in Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. And today I'll be talking to you on the module on gender and intersectionality theory, which is part of the paper on gender and social work. This concept of intersectionality essentially, again, is a very complex term, and this module would try to endeavor to see how do we move beyond a single axis gaze to trying to understand the multiple points which helps in shaping women's experiences. So therefore, the topics that we will attempt to discuss today would be trying to understand this idea, notion, theory, whatever we want to call it, of intersectionality and how that leads to intersecting discriminations. We'll also try to look at some of the narratives of intersectional experiences of women belonging to different communities and its importance in social work practice, the context of emergence of intersectionality and the factors for that emergence, intersectionality and its relevance and popularity, how today intersectionality has become another jargon. How do we try to unpack that? What would be some of the theories of intersectional methodology, if there is a methodology at all? We'll try to see that. And some of the critiques of intersectional methodology as it is emerging. And finally, we'll try to conclude and see intersectionality, which is a relatively new and evolving theory within feminist studies, within gender discourse, how it's shaping up today and what is its relevance in trying to understand women's position and what is its relevance in trying to alter women's subjugation. So what is intersectionality? Intersectionality refers to the intersection between different categories. For example, intersection of gender with race, with caste, with identity, and a lot of other categories of difference in individual lives, in social practices, in institutional arrangements, and in cultural ideologies, and how the outcome of these interactions in terms of power shape experiences of communities, shapes experiences of women. This particular visual would help us to visually see how multiple discriminations and layered discriminations happen in the lives of women. So intersectionality can be used to understand how different structures of power, which could be caste, like we said, identity, create this layered and multiple discriminations. This is not to negate the discriminations that are collectively happening to marginalized communities as a whole, but within that context, intersectionality also gives us a lens to understand the multiple and layered experiences and layered subjugation of a woman. So if I'm a woman and an urban woman and an educated woman, I have certain kind of experiences. If it's a tribal woman without land, there are certain other kinds of experiences. And how do we factor it in our understanding and in our social work practice? Gender and intersectionality, therefore, can be understood as an integrated approach that identifies and analyzes multiple forms of discrimination. So the intersectionality theory also tries to say here that it's not about just A plus B plus C equal to something. It's not just a sum total of different identities or discrimination, but it leads to much more when we are talking about multiple forms of discrimination. It also talks about interaction of two or more forms of discrimination that often multiplies discrimination, often compounds discrimination, and further, intersectionality identifies marginalized women as experiencing many visible and not so visible interacting discrimination. Often I realize being part of many of these movements, for example, tribal movements, movements of nomadic tribes, denotified tribes, we don't talk about women in these communities. And when we start talking about women in these communities, often there is a resistance because the idea is that these communities are collectively marginalized, and if we talk about women's discrimination within that, that might create problem for the movement. Now, why this happens? This essentially happens because marginalized women's oppressions are often invisible. Their interacting discriminations are often invisible, and they get clubbed within the understanding and oppression of the communities as a whole. Narratives of intersectional experiences will look at some incidents, some life stories to understand how this intersectional experiences happens and what is its relevance. This is the story of Mutamma. Mutamma is a village woman working on a daily wage in somebody else's field. So she's an old lady who is a daily wage laborer. That obviously means she does not have her own land. She works in somebody else's land. She has a daughter, and that's her only daughter. And her daughter is married. Her daughter has a son. And because her daughter's son is ill, she comes visiting her mother for a few days. And she also needs some money for his treatment. The daughter needs some money for her son's treatment. So Mutamma does not have any money. So she goes to the landlord's house and she begs of the woman, the landlord's wife, or the the woman who has the land, in whose land she is working. She begs for money. She says that it is urgent, she needs it, and she can give it, she can cut it from her salary later. She tries to meet this lady thrice, but that lady, the landlady, says that I can't give you the money without asking my husband, and if I give you this money, my husband will really be very, very angry with me. And he is not here now, and I can't give you the money. Mutamma comes back and she has to send away her daughter without that money, and she's extremely sad because she knows what it means. It means that her daughter's son won't get enough treatment. Also, it might happen that because the daughter doesn't take that money from her mother's house, her in-laws will not be very pleased with it, and it can lead to several other subjugation. This is a complex story which talks about intersectionality in various forms. First, Mutamma. Intersectionality in terms of her identity, of being a tribal woman, intersectionality in terms of class, being a landless laborer, and gender. Then there is this other woman who has land but does not have power. Then there is her daughter who is also disadvantaged because her age. So we see how this complex intersectionalities create different kinds of disadvantages for different women, and it is so important to understand these disadvantages and take it back into our work to be able to make some dent. I'll give you another example, which might be important when we work, because often when we overlook these intersectionalities, our work doesn't lead to its outcome, stated outcome that we are aiming at. For example, in one of the villages, again in Maharashtra, this NGO was working with the women, and they formed a women's collective, and they thought that they would start a livelihood program with these women. which was good enough. Now they also thought that they would look at the local resources and start a livelihood program which is aligned to the contextual realities and the resources that are already available. So there was a fish pond and they thought that they will start a small fish shop. And they thought that all women would be together in it. So a few days it went on well, but then started the problem. There was another shop which was of the sarpanch or the village head, which was a meat shop. Now the fish shop was posing competition to the meat shop. So this particular man, the sarpanch, the head of the village, wanted to close down this fish shop. It is still okay, it was still going that way. But what happened was, few women aligned with the sarpanch and a few women stayed with the self-help group started by the NGO. Why so? Because some of the identity or caste leanings of these women who were part of this SHG were with the sarpanch. So the women got divided. So what started as a developmental effort by the NGO actually led to a conflict in the village. And one major cause of this conflict was this women thought, NGO thought the women are a homogeneous category and they didn't try to understand their affiliations and the differences that exist. So it's very, very important if we are to look at an outcome of our work, it's very important to understand this contextual realities and the differences. Context of emergence of intersectionality. The term intersectionality was first introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. Who was Crenshaw? Crenshaw was a black feminist lawyer, and through her cases, she tried to understand that the experience of race and gender were often looked as a homogeneous category together and or treated as mutually exclusive categories. The single axis framework also created a conceptual problem because it erased the black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race and sex differentiation by limiting inquiry to experiences of only otherwise privileged members of the group. Today, intersectionality is quite a popular jargon. So how do we understand the relevance of intersectionality? How do we understand the popularity and see, is it a jargon or is there any relevance in it? Though Crenshaw first used the term intersectionality in 1989, it has since then been used globally in different contexts. The parameters of intersectionality and its relevance to feminist theorizing is given by Davis, and some of those key parameters are the theory of intersectionality addresses one of the most central and normative concern within feminist scholarship, namely the acknowledgement of the differences that exist within women. And often it is said that because of this acknowledgement of differences by intersectionality theory, it has also become very popular, because most other feminist theories, except for some of the newer ones like Dalit feminism, etc., the feminist theories are largely look at women as homogeneous categories. So this was an important point. So how does intersectionality theorists try to understand these differences? There are two key points. The first is that they try to understand these effects of different identities in terms of caste, class, race, gender, etc., and how it influences women's struggles for empowerment, their experiences. And the second one was inspired by postmodern theoretical perspectives, which is about trying to deconstruct this binary oppositions and a larger notion of universalism in trying to understand women, their experiences and their oppression. Now we go to the next parameter, which talks about that any successful social theory needs to be able to give a solution to a problem in an innovative way. Now that's again a difference which really brought intersectionality to the limelight, because largely in most of our theoretical understandings, including feminist theories, there's a lot of analysis, but there is nothing on the ground. This particular intersectionality theory draws attention to it and tries to say that we need to use innovations to be able to address some of this larger complex problems that are happening, and not just talk about it. Now, how much of it is actually getting into practice, implemented, how much of solutions is there is a different question, but it at least started thinking and talking about it. The next one, it talks about successful social theory should also appeal to both, should appeal to generalist as well as specialist of the discipline. Now, as we are aware, most of the feminist theories are largely confined to the academia, and people in general, activists, etc., often say that this feminist theories are distanced from their work, distanced from their lives. They're very analytical, they're very theoretical. So Davis explains that as intersectionality became a buzzword, it captured the interest of both the generalist and at the same time also there were numerous theoretical debates which caught the attention of the specialist or the theoreticians or the theorist. Further, and much more importantly, she points out that intersectionality provides a much needed bridge between feminist researchers, feminist activists, and feminist theoreticians. And the last key point that Davis talks about, or the parameter that Davis talks about, is that successful social theory should be inherently ambiguous and open-ended. She reflects on the various debates about and around intersectionality, and instead of looking at them as a marker of insufficiency of the theory, she looks at them in a positive light and points out that this debates and ambiguity could allow for further innovation, could also allow for further improvement and change. And I think that is also a key factor in intersectionality theory, essentially because intersectionality theory is very new and it is evolving. So not everything is perfect, not everything is written, and there is scope to work on it, there is scope to develop it, and I suppose that is again another strength of intersectionality theory, like Davis says. Theories of intersectional methodology. Now, let's see if there is a methodology to practicing intersectionality. Nash, in the writing of Nash, Mackall notes that despite the emergence of intersectionality as a major paradigm of research in women's studies and elsewhere, there has been very little discussion of how to actually study or how to actually practice intersectionality and its methodology. Mackall analyzes three distinct intersectional methodologies, which are anti-categorical complexity, intra-categorical complexity, and inter-categorical complexity. Now let's see what is it. The words definitely sounds complex. Let's try to simplify and see how we can understand it. Anti-categorical complexity. It starts from the theoretical assumption that different categories, like race, like gender, sometimes are too simplistic to capture the complexity of lived experiences. Now they also emphasize that scholarly deployment of categories might reinstall the regimes of progressive work which is trying to destabilize it. For example, we talk about annihilation of caste. Now, if we bring caste as a major category again, that's what the anti-categorical feminists are talking about, that if we bring it again, it might move away from the transformative work that we are trying to do to destabilize it. And simultaneously, these different categories might not actually lead to the understanding of the complexities together. It could be beyond these categories. So basically, anti-categorical complexity is talking about move beyond existing categories, move beyond concepts of different identities, and that will help us to understand the differences better. Next, we go on to intra-categorical complexity. Takes marginalized intersectional identities, this particular concept takes marginalized intersectional identities as an analytical starting point in order to understand and reveal the complexity of the experiences of different groups. We had discussed earlier, being a woman and being a black woman, how that shapes the experiences. So basically it talks about different categories, how they interact and how they multiply the experiences, and the understanding on black women, the understanding on Dalit women in India could be some of the examples around this. In particular, intracategorical understanding or intracategorical complexity analyzes or analyzes and attains to the different categorization and does not reject the categorization itself, but talks about how it multiplies certain kinds of oppression and leads to certain kind of experiences. Now we come to intercategorical complexity. It talks about, in very simple terms, within certain groups, within certain identity groups, what are the differential experiences within that? Between men and women, we also see that in many of the marginalized groups, there are some people who are very powerful, there are some people who might not be so powerful. So it provisionally adopts existing analytical categories to document relationships of inequality among social groups and trying to understand the changing configurations of inequality along multiple and conflicting dimensions, begins with the observation that there are relationships of inequality among already constituted social groups. So it could be nomadic tribes, but within nomadic tribes, the experiences of men and women could be different. The main work that this approach performs is therefore to expose the relationships between inequality and the categories themselves and use these categories strategically in the service of displaying the linkage between categories and the inequities or inequalities that exist. Having understood these different categories and the key thoughts in intersectionality, some of the overall critique would be to, for example, to understand the limitations, and there are many theorists who have spoken about different dimensions criticizing it. For example, according to some feminists, feminist spaces claim to use intersectionality approach, yet there is still a very limited understanding of the term. Basically, they talk about the theory is still evolving, and it might be too ambitious at this point to say that we are able to understand all the differences and experiences. Listing of differences does not in and of itself create the possibility of systemic change. It does not ensure that we ourselves do not replicate some of the damaging values of our dominant culture. So it basically says that, just if you list down the differences and identify the differences does not mean that we are able to transcend the differences, change the status quo. Some of the Indian feminists, for example, Nivedita Menon, also presents a critique of intersectionality in the Indian context. Her critique of intersectionality is based on the idea of imperialism of categories, by which she means that the tendency is to assume universal validity of ideas developed in the so-called global north, while the reverse is never assumed for ideas developed in the global south. So here she is also trying to look at this so-called first world, third world, developed countries, developing countries of knowledge hierarchies that is there. And she tries to say that intersectionality is located within those kind of knowledge hierarchies, largely coming from the Western world. Another critique is, they also elaborate that intersectionality seems to be working for international funding agencies and state policies instead of feminism. By that, they mean that because of the popularity of the term, it has often been co-opted into the language of governance and hence loses its potential for change. Some of the jargons that we use today in development lexicon, like empowerment, like participation, intersectionality is increasingly going in that league and getting depoliticized, and therefore not really helping the feminist discourses to try and analyze and change some of the existing power structures. It's basically getting co-opted. Having discussed the theory of intersectionality so far, I'd like to conclude and summarize some of the key understandings, including how intersectionality has emerged in the late 1980s and early 1990s from critical race studies, which is a scholarly movement born in the legal academy committed to problematize laws purported colorblindness, neutrality, and objectivity, and how Crenshaw has brought this to the forefront through her understanding and through her writings. And we have also spoken about intersectionality, trying to understand the multiple marginalities, multiple discrimination, thereby rejecting the single axis framework often embraced by both feminist and anti-racist scholars, and the various ways in which race and gender, etc., interact to shape multiple dimensions of women's experiences, especially marginalized women's experiences. We have also used several perhaps jargons and words which are a little complex, like the different methodological approaches, like anti-categorical complexity, intra-categorical complexity, intercategorical complexity. But these are essentially useful terms to be able to unpack the idea of intersectionality and see how it operates. And once you read it a little more, you will realize it's not so difficult as it sounds, or not so complex as it sounds. To deepen this understanding further, there are a few readings, and some of the key readings would be to look at definitely Crenshaw's work on race, sex, black feminist work, Davis Cathy, where she talks about how intersectionality becomes a buzzword, and also some of the important readings which are located in India, for example, Nivedita Menon and Meena Gopal. So I would like to leave you with this, again, important quote around intersectionality. There is no such thing as single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives, by Audrey. And I think this is the essence of intersectionality which we can take back with us. Thank you so much.